I am Amanda Napper. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Niagara Peninsula branch of the Ontario Ancestors. Hopefully you've joined us tonight because you've seen my newsletter. If you haven't seen my newsletter, you can pick it up at niagara.ogs.on.ca. There's a sign-up form right on the homepage, and it'll get you a whole bunch of information about different opportunities in the region, things that we're doing in the branch, and new resources that we have available. A few housekeeping items before we start. We're going to be off webinars for the summer. You may see a few newsletters, and we've definitely got an exciting announcement from My Heritage in July, so stay tuned for that in your newsletter. We've also got two exciting opportunities in September. On September 17th, Mark Olson from Family Tree Maker will join us for a live in-person training. More details about that will be coming out very shortly, and that will be for the latest software, Family Tree Maker 2024. And then 2 days later, we'll have our regular webinar with representatives from Canadiana who will be joining us to talk about all of the amazing resources on their site. As well, it's always membership season. We appreciate your support and would love for you to support the Niagara branch. You just have to tick the Niagara box when you join the OGS, and it gives you special benefits: access to Niagara-specific resources, assistance with your genealogy brick walls, supports projects to help us preserve Niagara's heritage, and support our ability to continue these webinars. Our master index that is available on our site is also now on ancestry.com. So you may find your relatives on ancestry.com lead you back to our master index to find your resources. And I think that's about all I've got for now, but I will introduce Sara Nixon, who was raised in Grimsby and has a master's degree in public history from Carleton University, and she's built a career in the museum and heritage fields over the past 15 years. Sara is the Director of Community Engagement at the Brown Homestead and currently serves as the chair of the Grimsby Heritage Advisory Committee. Welcome, Sara. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're very happy to have you here.
I just want to say thank you so much for having me tonight. This is really great. I know that Andrew and Jennifer, the co-founders of the Brown Homestead, did speak to you a couple years ago. So I'm really hoping that this can be an update and kind of a refresher, and also bring some new stories and a peek behind the scenes of what we've been able to do since Andrew and Jennifer were here last. The story I'm going to share today is we're moving between past, present, and future. We're going in through time, and we'll talk about the stories of the house as well as some of the restoration. So I guess with that, we can get going.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I must say, I think Andrew was like the first webinar I did. so,
Oh my God.
I'm excited to have an update. Absolutely.
Fantastic. Okay, yes, fantastic. Then without further ado, I'll get
Mm.
started. But again, my name is Sara. Again, I'm the Director of Community Engagement at the Brown Homestead, and I'm really happy to be here. The Brown Homestead, you might recall this big, beautiful stone building that we have here. This kind of the center of the tapestry of the stories that I'll be sharing today. And these stories are interweaving. Now, the Brown Homestead is within the traditional and historic territory of the Audouin, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee people. And today, Niagara is home to many additional Indigenous peoples. We recognize and celebrate their friendship and continuing alliances that make it possible for us to live here. We also honor the threads of Indigenous history that are woven into the stories of the Brown Homestead and beyond. So we have over 2 centuries of history, 4 different families. The land surrounding the home has been cleared, settled, and farmed, first cultivating grain and corn, and then fruit orchards, now vineyards. Pelham Road, which curves around the property, was first carved out by Indigenous peoples centuries ago to connect to a larger trail network. And later, this trail was used by horse-drawn carriages, and now, of course, we have cars and bicycles. And the house itself has witnessed the invention of electricity, plumbing, the telephone, radio, television, and even the internet, withstanding a constant siege of fitting of new wires, pipes, and adapters to accommodate advances in technology. But all the while, through all of this change, this house has stood. Now, the oldest part of the John Brown House was built in 1796, and this is an impressive 29 years ago. The house's namesake was for the head of the United Empire Loyalist family who fled to Niagara during the American Revolution. They lived and farmed in the Schoharie Valley, where John and his family sided with the British at the onset of the American Revolutionary War and were eventually persecuted to the point where they could no longer stay. I imagine that this is a history that many of you are familiar with, given your connections to Ontario ancestry as a group. Now, here we have Fort Niagara. When John Brown was ordered to leave New York, his land and farm and house and possessions, as well as the land that his wife had inherited, were all seized. So John had little choice but to leave for Fort Niagara as a place of refuge. By 1781, he joined the Colonel John Butler's Rangers, where he ranked as a private. And it's unclear whether John took part in any fighting, but by the time he joined, the Americans had practically won. And Fort Niagara was a major outpost for the British through the latter half of the 1700s, and it operated as the headquarters for Colonel Butler and the Mohawk war chief Joseph Brant during the Revolutionary War. After the war ended in 1783, Fort Niagara continued to receive an exponentially increasing number of refugees, up to 10,000 loyalists by 1790. And the indigenous population that was also displaced by the war remained around the fort until they were dispersed elsewhere in Canada. And all this time, the British continued to feed and clothe and shelter these families. But as you can imagine, as immigration increased, resources were spread thinner. And it wasn't just the continued arrival of loyalists that contributed to the population growth at Fort Niagara. Families were growing too. John and Magdalena Brown had come to Niagara with their 4 young daughters, but it's thought that their first son, Adam Brown, was born at the fort in 1785. The fear of starvation was a top concern as more and more stress was placed on the Crown stores at the fort, but one only needed to look to the vast, untouched landscape of west of the Niagara River for the solution. And by the mid 1780s, settler society emerged in the Niagara Peninsula, and the United Empire Loyalists became the first to call Niagara home since the Adirondack. Now, this is a typical scene of what Niagara might have looked like to those early settlers. The Adirondack were Iroquoian-speaking people known by Jesuit priests as the Neutral Confederacy. They inhabited the peninsula for about 300 years, where they hunted, traded, and even cultivated some agriculture until their disappearance in the mid-1600s due to smallpox, Haudenosaunee warfare, and famine. But then, the Niagara Peninsula, it had a lot to offer its new settlers, similar to what drew Indigenous activity to the area all those centuries ago. We have Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, as well as the rivers and creeks that cut through the peninsula, and these provided ample fresh water, fishing, and transportation. The fertile soil and temperate climate proved advantageous for growing and cultivation. The long ridge of the Niagara Escarpment, as well as the hills and valleys of the short hills, also offered the opportunity to harness water power for milling. Following the end of the American Revolutionary War in 1783, the British gave permission to Loyalists to begin to settle the land, despite the peninsula still being the territory of the Mississaugas up to this point. That same year, the Crown facilitated the distribution of the first land grants that we see. So often this was 100 acres of land to each head of each Loyalist family, 200 acres to every non-commissioned officer, and 50 acres to every family member and single man. And of course, this is general. But the land in Niagara wasn't officially under the British Crown until 1784 with the first signing of the Between the Lakes Treaty. And this agreement ceded the land situated between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie from the Mississaugas to the British. Following that purchase, and this was re signed as Treaty 3 in 1792, Loyalist families quickly dispersed and laid claim to what they felt was rightfully owed to them after all that they suffered and lost in the Revolutionary War. And what we have here, this little red dot that you see on the map, this is about where John Brown would have settled. The map is pointing north is down below where Lake Ontario is. And you can see the Niagara Rivers on the left-hand side there, and we see some names that are familiar to us. This map that I have on the screen here is from 1815 and gives a good sense of kind of that early settlement to the area following the War of 1812. But see, this is why I need my script. I keep going off. Okay, so another map to show. Here we have a map of the transportation routes of the Niagara Peninsula in the 1790s, and most of these were carved by Indigenous peoples centuries before. So the Brown family, they had laid claim to their little nook of Niagara at the edge of the short hills between 1784 and 1786. But I wouldn't go as far as to say that the Browns really carved out their own path to get there. Before the arrival of the Loyalists, there was a complex network of trails that crisscrossed Niagara, and this was already established and used by Indigenous people for centuries. There were really three main east-west trails located along the Niagara Escarpment, and it just so happens that the Browns settled along the route of one of them. This is the Mohawk Trail, which would become Pelham Road today. Here on the map, where my red dot is locating the approximate location of where the Brown family would have settled. We see the Mohawk Trail connecting above the escarpment. Another familiar trail to people living in Niagara might be the Iroquois Trail, which runs along the base of the escarpment. And of course, that's Old Highway 8 as we know today. Again, give or take. Now, the route that had been established all those centuries ago, that was for a reason, right? The terrain was easy enough to navigate by horse or on foot. It was close to water sources and vegetation, and as it turns out, very fertile soil. In total, John Brown received 900 acres in land grants stretching into Louth, Thorold, and Pelham townships at the junction of the Short Hills. And this is where all of those three townships meet. So we can see on this map that I have here, we have the land grants placed on top of a current satellite image of the area. And you can see here we have, I think there's 700 acres or 700 acres noted on this map. A 900 or another 200 came later. But this original 700 acres was in 1797. And you can see that most of it is in the Short Hills. Now, these parcels would have formally been granted to the Browns after they had already settled, right? They would have arrived on the land, begun clearing it at the time of their initial arrival, and Louth wasn't officially surveyed into its neat gridded parcels until a few years later. And it all sounds well and good that John chose to settle along a well-known trail like the Mohawk Trail, but if we have to remember that this route didn't look like what it does today, right? We don't have these fancy pavings and shoulders, but the inlands of the peninsula were covered in thick, old growth forest. And the Adirondack may have fished, hunted, and traveled through up until the mid 1600s, but they wouldn't have cleared the land for agriculture in the same sense. These forests were generally untouched. And while it's one thing to carve out a trail, it would have been an incredible hardship to clear the woods, erect a suitable dwelling, and plant crops. So the government, the British Crown, had actually supplied early loyalists with canvas tents, axes as well as tools and some provisions to get them started. But the work was really up to them. Neighboring families would join together to chop down the first trees to build a log cabin in the small clearing they created. These houses would have looked like you're imagining, right? We have small walls built of round logs notched together with the corners and stacked maybe 8 feet high. So here, this cabin that we see on the screen, it's not original to our site or the Brown family, but it is reminiscent of what the Browns may have built here. This wooden home belonged to Mohawk leader Teonarakaron, also known as Major John Norton, a political and military leader around the time of the War of 1812. So this home was built by Norton in Caledonia in 1817 after the war, and it was moved to the Brown Homestead in 1997 to save it from demolition. So when the Brown family first arrived to where they would settle, they would have settled or they would have built a log cabin that looked similar to this. And here they would have lived and grown and celebrated and laughed and toiled and cried until they could have built a permanent home several years later. And they did. This here, the back half of the Brown homestead now was the first 1.5-story stone house on the property. Now, to date the house, we use the ratification year of John Brown's land grant. One of the requirements of ratifying a land grant was to build a permanent dwelling of a certain dimension and to inhabit it for a year. This 1.5-story house fits within those dimensions. So if the land grant was ratified in 1797, then the house was built a year before. And the oldest part of the Brown homestead then was built in 1796. This is what makes the John Brown house the oldest home in St. Catharines. Now, from what we can tell, there was no cellar underneath this home, but there would have been a root cellar around for the family's preserves. We get that question a lot. Here is the interior of that one-room home. And this is where John and Magdalena and their children would have lived, worked, and played. It was a one-room family living, right? We did our cooking, our sewing, our eating, our celebrating, our socializing, laundry on this room. This is also where John and Magdalena would have slept. And then upstairs, there is a loft on the home accessed by a very questionable staircase that's quite narrow. That's where the children would have slept. What was in the upstairs loft. And now in total, John and Magdalena had 9 children. The 4 oldest, all daughters. We have Eve, Sophia, Catherine, and Magdalena or Mary. And they were born all back in Schoharie in upstate New York before the war. Some were now married and had children of their own by the time that they moved into the stone house here. But there is record of at least one grandchild being born on the property and living in this house. They also had their firstborn son, Adam, was born in 1785, which I mentioned earlier, possibly he was born at Fort Niagara. And then there was 4 other sons as well, so 5 sons total. They had David, John, Christian, and Abraham, who were all born in the log home first built on the property. Abraham, the youngest, was born in February 1796, so just as the family was building their stone house here. So I can imagine that the cabin was bursting at the seams by the time that Abraham was born. But of course, we have this big, beautiful home now, and it would have taken a while, quite a few years to build this grand addition. It was completed between 1802 and 1804. And this is the grand facade that we are familiar with as we pass by on Pelham Road today. The stone is built mainly of a Reynolds dolomite limestone. And I mentioned that the type of limestone is significant because it is its native or its home in the short hills. So this kind of limestone comes from the short hills. And we have a theory that it was likely quarried down the road towards Effingham and then dragged back on sleds pulled by horses and oxen. There's also thought that there might have been a mason involved with building the home. And if that's the case, it was likely the same mason who built another impressive Georgian home in the area. And that would have been John DeQ's house on top of the hill there on the escarpment. John Brown and John DeQ were friends. There was a roadway that connected their two properties called the Brown DeQ Road. And it's thought possibly that they were built of the same style, and possibly that might be the case, but still to be confirmed. But so this stone, it's also notable because it's a bit soft. It's softer than other limestone in the area. And if you visit the home, you'll see that there's significant erosion from wind, rain, and snow over its 220 years. But I like to say that if it's withstood up until this point, it probably has at least another 220 years left, which is something to note. Now, we also do need to get or investigate a little bit more as to how the Brown family had the means to actually build this two-story Georgian house. He again was a modest loyalist farmer. He ranked as private in the American Revolution or in the Butler's Rangers. So we're still quite I'm not quite sure exactly where the funds came from to be able to afford a home like this, but we do have some theories. We think that the reparations that they were given for what they've lost in the United States, the British Crown would have paid reparations. Those funds might have helped the cause. Magdalena, as I mentioned, had inherited land. She had about 300 acres, I believe, and she was given reparations for that. So that money might have helped. But another likely thought is that part of their land grant might have had access to quarried stone. So if they had stone on the property, they really just needed to bring it to the home and build. So those are some of our ideas about how a modest farming family was able to come to a house like this. Stone homes are quite rare, especially in this part of Niagara. A lot of the wealth at this point was in Niagara on the Lake. We don't see as much of that wealth over in Louth. So again, something that I wanted to mention. Okay, here we have a John Brown house a little bit later in time in the 1910s. Now, the John Brown house is built in the Georgian style, and this is mainly marked by symmetry, balance, and proportion based on the classical architecture of ancient Greece and Rome. So the exterior of the style is historically quite restrained, but it exudes in a grandeur and an elegance that I just love. And I think that's why visitors or passerbys that come upon the John Brown house, it would have aroused a certain awe back then in 1802 as well as today. And the size of the house lent well to the size of the Brown family. But we also have to remember that at this time, Niagara looked quite different. At the turn of the 1800s, churches and other community gathering spaces were still pretty makeshift. The loyalists settling in the area were really focused on building their homesteads and beginning their farms. They weren't building purpose-built structures yet. The home might have been used for religious services, business, political meetings, council meetings, as well as for local celebrations and entertainment. And the symmetry of the house is also seen inside as well. We have linear hallways, doors, and windows that mirror one another. And this allows for a clear distinction of what is private or family space and then what is public space for the community to use. This is what enabled the ballroom to be located upstairs across the hall from the bedrooms. So on the screen here, this photograph, we go up the stairs and that doorway on the left, that is the doorway into the ballroom, which would have been used as a entertaining space at the time. And this is for the Brown family. Now, downstairs, that original 1.5 story section of the home, that became the kitchen, which could easily service the family's dining room or up that narrow staircase that I mentioned earlier to service food to the ballroom. Now, our restoration work, and let me see if I have a picture. Yes, here it is. So again, was used as a kitchen after a big house was built. Now, our restoration work of what we call the summer kitchen, this was completed at the end of 2023. And a big project here were plaster repairs as well as the repointing the masonry of the hearth that you see here. So we've repointed and then also fixed up the bake oven so that these are now usable features for heritage cooking. And once we complete that very long process of passing current fire safety regulations, we hope to hold the programming here one day in the future. Now, efforts to restore the John Brown House, they began long before the Brown Homestead as an organization acquired the home, and these began back in the 1880s. Some of you might be familiar with a heritage practitioner, John Jupian. He purchased the home in 1879. Oh my goodness, he purchased the home in 1979. And at this point, the home had operated as a family farmhouse for close to 200 years. And it endured all of the changes that you can imagine this entails. So I mentioned, of course, in my introduction that there have been different families that have inhabited the home over its lifetime so far. We have the Brown family, of course. We also have the Chalou and the Powers families, who I'll share a bit about later, but also the Jupian family. John Jupian and his family lived in the house for a period while he pursued his restoration of the home. He had a vision to restore the home back to what it would have looked like during the Georgian era in the early 1800s and to hope eventually open it up to the public as a historic house museum. Now we can thank John Jupian for a lot of the discoveries the heritage discoveries that we have in the home, as he began to peel back layers of wallpaper and walls and flooring, removing modern walls and amenities. He uncovered really valuable clues as to how each generation of family lived in the house, how they used the rooms and made it a home. And this work really has informed the Brown Homestead's own rehabilitation efforts that we're undertaking today. Now, before I go further, I do want to point out a significant difference between the practice of restoration, which was what John Jupian had been committed to, and the kind of work that the Brown Homestead is pursuing. So the idea of restoration is to accurately reveal, recover, and represent the state of a historic place as it appeared at a particular period in its history. So for John Jupian's vision, again, was to restore it back to that early 1800s Georgian era when the Brown family first built the house. Now, the work at the Brown Homestead, we focus on a practice called rehabilitation. So this is the sensitive adaptation of a historic place for continuing or compatible contemporary use while protecting its heritage value. So our focus is rather on revitalization and connecting or drawing a connection between past, present, and future rather than going back to one moment in the past. And I have a few examples of this process. So, for example, we have wall stencils that were uncovered by John Jupian in the dining room of the house. So, here is a photo of that discovery in the 1980s. As he peeled back the many layers of wallpaper covering the walls, they found remnants of decorative wall stencils dating between about the 1820s and the 1840s when the Brown family still occupied the house. Might have another picture of it? Not yet. Oh, okay, we'll stick to this photo right now. So it was really fashionable during this time for these stencils to have likely covered the walls and bordered the doors and with a really intricate design. And this is what John Jupian attempted to recreate. So this is the restoration of the dining room of the John Brown house under the John Jupian era, where he recreated what this wall stencils might have looked like throughout the room. And he also preserved 3 sections of original stencils as well. Now, our approach is a bit different. So we've still preserved those original wall stencils, but instead of duplicating what we can only guess the decorative wall art might have looked like, our approach is rather to showcase the craft of stenciling itself. So we traced all of John's motifs, photo documented the entire room, and then we painted over his work while continuing to preserve those original stencils. And so here we have some photos just to show that process. Oh, I did it again. I'm giving spoilers. Okay, another example of this is the floor stenciling. So the decorative stenciling during the Brown era has also been uncovered on the main floor hallway. So the original pine floors were embellished with a country impression of Venetian tile. It used iron red oxide stenciled over a yellow ochre background. And the remnants of this floor decoration was found at the very far end of the main floor hallway sometime in the 1990s. And again, John Jupian would have recreated the stenciling and covered the original with plywood to preserve it. Our approach instead was to re-stencil the hallway using a modern paint palette, but that same process of hand stenciling, we traced that stencil, the original stencils that we found, and we just brought it out across the rest of the hallway here. We've also, I don't have a picture, but we also have a plexiglass. We've placed a plexiglass wood frame over top of this stencil here to allow visitors to walk over the flooring without causing damage while still appreciating this 200-year-old craftsmanship. So if you were to come to the homestead today, you'll be able to see this original stencil. Okay, returning our attention to the full picture, the full history, not only the decor, but the very function of the house's rooms would have evolved as the needs of the Brown family also evolved. With each change, an additional thread was woven into the story of the homestead. Family members would grow up, they'd get married, move out, and start their own families as well. Others would pass away. The John Brown, he died in 1804. He's buried atop of a bank in the short hills close by with a view of the grand house he labored so hard to build. His wife Magdalena would join him there 2 days later. Now, maybe this is a bit of inside knowledge now, but we are doing some really interesting research into the location of the Brown family burial ground. We have located it in the Short Hills. It's a top secret location right now, but in the coming months, we do hope to pursue a ground penetrating radar and hopefully be able to commemorate the site publicly in the coming year. So that's one of the research projects that I'm working on right now. Now, back to the family. After John and Magdalena died, the land was willed to be divided amongst his children. And the house itself, the homestead, it was willed to his eldest son, Adam, and his youngest son, Abraham, who was only 7 at the time. And this means that by 1804, the story of the home passes on to the next generation of the Brown family. This is a new era of history, a new layer of history. And with that, Adam Brown, now at the helm of the family home, he welcomed in a new era as a tavern. So from as early as 1809, the Brown family homestead operated as both a home and farm, as well as an inn tavern. In the early years of the 1800s in Upper Canada, taverns were the most numerous social spaces in the colony. And it's true that Brown's Tavern, as it was known, there's records that it offered respite for soldiers retreating from Fort George during the War of 1812. But we also know that the doors would have been open for all types of characters from all sorts of backgrounds across race, class, and occupation. And this is because the tavern served as a local meeting space. Especially in the early years of Loyalist settlement, folks hadn't quite gotten around to erecting a purpose-built space to house fraternal and voluntary associations, as well as commercial offices. Especially in a rural community like Louth, patrons would gather and enjoy a drink over conversation with both locals and travelers. They would conduct business dealings, pay bills, discuss the news of the day, organize political campaigns, or hold council meetings, all in this space, as well as that kind of typical tavern friendship that you think of, like reminiscing over old stories, conversation, chatter. All of that was taking place in the room of the tavern inside the John Brown house. And this would have been a space for men and women, politicians and farmers, business moguls, laborers, skilled tradespeople, and widows, on and on. The illustration that we have here, this came from the Francis Tavern Museum in New York City, which I was excited. I got to visit the museum in the fall, but anyway. So this illustration is what the kind of the general mood of the Brown's Tavern might have looked like. So it would have been quite modest. They would have had a small hearth to provide warmth, candle or oil lamp lighting, a few tables, pine benches, but most importantly would have been the stocked bar. That's what really would have made this an appealing space to spend time. So how do we know that Adam Brown operated a tavern here all those years ago? We actually, our first clue was uncovering a really unique frame in the walls of what we now call the parlor. So the frame of the original cage bar, which was a typical serving counter for the era, it still stands. So if I just go back to the illustration here, you see the bar on the right corner of this illustration. That's your typical bird cage bar, which gets its name by looking like a bird cage. So what we're looking at, this frame, is thought to be the frame of that original bar. And this is due to the woodwork is quite detailed. It's quite decorative. And so because of that decorative woodwork, like this frame that we see here has all of these details and dovetails in it, this would have not been used to just cover with lath and plaster, right? It would have been meant to be displayed. So that was the first clue. And then we move into the archives to look for those clues. And that's when we find some really interesting sources. Where was my source? Here we go. So here we have a tavern license, or still license rather, from 1810. So this is an account of still licenses, which was essentially a license to distill your own liquor and sell that liquor on your property. So this is an account of still licenses in Niagara issued in 1810, and we can see Adam Brown's name on this account here. So this is the first account that we see is 1809. Here we have 1810. And if we read the licenses, it notes that Adam Brown has a license for one still of 115 gallons of liquor. So that's pretty impressive here. So we go to the archives, we find this information, and this is how we're able to tell that what we see here, we uncover, is a bar. So we can see the markings around the bar here. And this is what the birdcage bar looks like after the Brown Homestead's rehabilitation work in February 2024. So we have a bit more digging to do, but it seems that in Upper Canadian government, they required distillers, shopkeepers, and innkeepers to hold annual licenses to sell spirits. So Adam Brown would have had to pay a fee to apply for a license. And then after a witness could vouch for his respectability, and then he's granted a license and required to pay an annual fee to keep it. So far, we found license records from as early as 1809 through to 1841. So this is pretty fascinating stuff that we really have only uncovered the surface of. So there's other threads that we can follow to learn more about where Adam Brown might have ordered the grains for his distillers. Do we have ledgers from surrounding mills to help tell us this? Is Brown's Tavern mentioned in local journals or newspapers? Are there more license records? These are all questions that we have. And just a little plug, but this tavern story does inform some of the programming that we do on site. We every winter, every February, we host a Taste of the Tavern, which is a whiskey tasting event. We gather guests in the upstairs ballroom of the homestead, and here we have AJ Bardois, who's Niagara's or Canada's first whiskey ambassador. He leads us on a guided whiskey tasting as we share the stories of Niagara's whiskey history. And we try and create that kind of congenial tavern atmosphere of the early 1800s. Other records we have of the tavern, there's also licenses of an inn that Adam Brown operated alongside the tavern. So you also needed a license to operate an inn, or you really just needed access to 4 stables and 3 beds that could be divided by a curtain to operate an inn for guests to sleep. And this makes a lot of sense that about this location, right? That Brown's Tavern would operate. We're right on Pelham Road, so this is a busy thoroughfare on top of the escarpment. It's the south or the north edge of the escarpment there. The Pelham Road's connecting downtown St. Catharines. It goes through to towards Niagara River, so it's being used by a lot of travelers. And the homestead is a significant landmark in a very rural area. So travelers who are looking for a place to stay would see this landmark and be happy to and feel a sense of respite when they walked in the doors. Also, our culture of hospitality is a lot different as well, right? At that time in the 1800s, if someone knocked on your door looking for a place to sleep or a meal to eat, you often opened up your doors to these people. So it would have been quite common for Adam Brown and his family to welcome in people to eat and drink and sleep. Lucky for Elizabeth Brown, his wife, to do all of this work. Okay, but let's move on. Adam Brown, he died in 1855. So he would have joined the headstones of the Brown family burial ground in the Short Hills. And after his father's death, Jacob Brown would have inherited his family's Loyalist homestead on Lot 3, Concession 8 in Louth. But he wouldn't have stayed here long. So we're at the 3rd generation of the Brown family. And only a few years later, Jacob Brown would have sold his grandfather's house, the house that his grandparents built. He sold it to another family named Joseph and Eliza Chalou. So in 1858, after 3 generations of settlement at the homestead, the Brown legacy does seemingly come to an end. And now we enter the Chalou era. Here we have the 1862 Tremaines map. And this is we have very few sources to tell us much about the Chalou family, which is quite frustrating. And as genealogists and local history researchers, you might share in that frustration with me. We know that the Chalous were the second stewards of the homestead. We know that they represent that Victorian era of family farming in Niagara, but we don't know much else. We know that they came from England. They immigrated in 1845 to pursue life as farmers. And they actually first lived around the corner from the Brown house for about a decade. On this map here, we have circled in yellow, we have Joseph Chalou. And this is that original Brown family lot. And then if you go up and right 1 lot, you see another Joseph Chalou lot. So that's his original lot, the original property. And then what I like to think happened is he was looking around the corner of Pelham Road and was looking at this really nice house. And because they had 11 children, they were probably saying, that's a lot of space. So I'd love to live there for all of my kids. So that's what I like to think happened. So in 1858, the Chalou family, they move in. and they make their own changes to the home. A lot of these are aesthetic and cosmetic. They make a lot of cosmetic kind of facelifts to the house. But one of the other things that they do inside is erect walls, right? They have 11 kids. They're not interested in entertaining space and social space as much as they are bedrooms for their 11 children. So here we have an image of our partition wall that divided the ballroom. By the 1860s, the Chalou family would have erected this wall, and this would have been then used into bedroom space. Now, we have since removed that 1860s partition wall. We've preserved those walls to be used in some way later. But before we did that work, we did preserve a lot and study the wallpaper that we found in these bedrooms. Because these were bedrooms, because the space was divided into several rooms, we've actually uncovered 25 layers of wallpaper within the space. And here are some examples of the wallpapers that we found. We have our project manager, Mackenzie Campbell. She's actually studying the wallpaper for us. She peels back the layers and she reveals as early as the earliest layer would have been a distemper, which would have been an early decorative paint binded with chalk, ground pigments, and animal glue. And then on top of that earliest distemper layer, we have wallpaper. And some of these wallpapers is also block printing as well. Now, other work that we've done in this ballroom, the ballroom has been our major restoration project over the last couple of years. And one of the projects we've done is actually rebuild part of the wall that was removed by later families to open up what they would have made as a kind of like a landing. We've want to recreate the footprint of that original ballroom. So we rebuilt part of that wall. And we did so using traditional heritage carpentry techniques. Here we worked with students in the Willowbank School of Restoration Arts, and we have, along with their instructor, heritage carpenter Doug Vickers, they use traditional building techniques to construct a plank and accordion lath wall. So the wall that you see in this photo here, this was actually milled by a Mennonite community using a steam engine mill. It would have been laid out in the sun for 8 hours a week for 8 weeks to take out some of that moisture. And then the planks were installed first, positioned around the door frame, and then accordion lath was created by hammering striations into the wood with a mallet and chisel, which you see a picture of here. And then it would have been nailed to the wall and pulled apart like an accordion. And this process is cool. So first we did this building of the wooden frame. And then we use that traditional plaster approach, and we got horsehair as you would traditionally. We actually went to a local horse farm, got to spend an afternoon with horses, but then also get some of the horsehair to add into our base coat plaster. So here we have our lime plaster, we mix in the horsehair, and then we applied this base coat to the wall that we made. So again, cool to see us recreate the original footprint of the room, which we have here. Now, other changes that the Chalous made were very typical of the Victorian era. So just like today, families that could afford it were really eager to decorate, and they were inspired by the latest home design trends, and appearance mattered. So the starkest updates we see are made to the front of the house. Here again, we have a veranda that spanned across the home. This was built by the Chalou family. And if we see close-ups of the porch here, we can see it's very Victorian, an ornate veranda that has a very elegant gingerbread detailing in the woodwork, which was very popular in the Victorian style, especially in the late 1800s. as was the practice of applying a parging to the front facade that imitates a fine cut stone ashlar wall. So here we can see like those really nice crisp white lines. That was actually like a layer of mortar that was applied across the whole front of the house. And then those crisp white lines were painted in to have the look of nice clean stone rather than the original stone that's beneath. They wanted, again, that kind of that facelift to really impress. And this parging is only on the front facade of the house. And you can see where those white lines are now. Some of that parging still exists on the house today. And you can see those white outlines on this image. Now, other Victoria era additions to the homestead, they include the construction of a smokehouse, which we have here, as well as a dairy. Now, thanks to the Chalou family and the wealth that they brought, the farm was definitely expanding. The dairy building was also known as a creamery, and it's characterized by kind of the lack of east or south facing windows to avoid direct sunlight. And here in the dairy is where milk would be stored in the morning, also where butter making and cheese making would have taken place. So with these purpose built buildings, the dairy and the smokehouse allowed for the growth of a small scale business on the property. Now, one of our ongoing restoration approaches is to restore and rehabilitate the dairy, eventually hoping to have the capability to sell ice cream. So we're calling this vision the Homestead Creamery. And you can see some of the work that we've done in the past. If you come to the home, here we have some of that adaptive reuse. We've done work to the interior windows here. We've installed sheep's wool installation. So this is some of the restoration work that we've done. We've also worked with Brock University students to design and the interior of the space with a 3D renderings of what the Homestead Creamery might look like in the future. Next up would be upgrading those modern needs like plumbing, electrical. We need freezers. We need all of that work. So we're currently looking for grants to do that project. As a nonprofit, a lot of this work we're hoping will become income generators in the future, but we do need the funds now in order to get these projects done. So that's something that we're pursuing. All right. I've gone back and forth and I've given many glimpses of many layers and eras of the homestead. And I'm recognizing the time. I know I've kept you for a while, but just a little bit longer because I want to share a bit about the Powers family, who are our third family to purchase the home. Here we have a photo of LaFontaine Powers around 1920. I always like to make the joke that I promise he has eyeballs, but just not in this photo here. But LaFontaine and his wife Marianne, and they purchased the homestead from the Chalou family in 1902. They come from Port Hope, and they bring along their 6 children, so much less children, a much smaller family, and they continue to farm on the property. So the Powers family, they take what the Chalous have done, the Chalous have more livestock, they plant some apple orchards, and the Powers expand this. They plant fruit orchards, as well as expand the barn to house more farm animals. We also know that the Powers, they grew plums, they grew vineyards as well. Grape vineyards for grape juice rather than the wine that kind of surrounds us now. And what's really wonderful about the Powers family era is we're very fortunate to have a family photo album that was kept by LaFontaine and Marianne's youngest daughter, Annie. And it's now in the care of under the St. Catharines Museum. So here are a few photos from that family album. And this is what we're missing from what we know about the Chalous life at the homestead. The Powers photo album offers a really wonderful glimpse into how the family would have lived and laughed and loved while they were here. We have a hammock on the front veranda here, and we have kids playing on a fence that once bordered the property that's no longer here. We can also see a lot of the photographs are also taken in front of the house. So clearly the front of the house was a point of pride for the family. We see them, they're gathered, they're smiling in their best dress. And we also can see how the horse was used. So again, we have that hammock, we have that fence along the veranda. We also have how the farm evolved. So in that top left corner image where we have a little girl on a fence, we also see across the street, which is now Short Hill Provincial Park, that looks like farmland. I see some orchards. I see a farm animal. It might have been grazing land. So we see how the space was used as well. And part of that is also the large barn that was on the property. So here we have a barn that has a multiple additions. We also see horse and cattle. This offers a really ample perspective of the barn that once stood on the property because it doesn't stand anymore. We don't have a date. But we do know that the Brown family would have built a barn. And we also know that barn likely would have been around throughout all of the different generations and eras of the homestead. So in this photograph, some part of this barn might be that original barn that the Browns built. Now, I mentioned that the barn no longer stands on the property, but we have purchased a barn that is similar in era and construction. And we do plan to re-erect that barn on our property to recreate that farmscape on the property. And we hope that when it does come time to do that, which will be in a couple of years, we do plan to host a community festival and lead a traditional barn raising like rural farming family communities would have done in the past. So, as you can tell by what I've shared today, a lot of really exciting work has happened up until this point, but there's a lot of really exciting things to come in the future as well. And that's why I like to say that the road ahead for the Brown Homestead, it is really exciting. It's taken us, Andrew and Jennifer, who again came on to talk to you a few years ago, it's taken their very careful strategic planning to get the organization up to this point. And we're playing the long game to ensure sustainability for our vision of what the homestead can be for the people of Niagara in the future. So we're very intentional about our approach to adaptive restoration, as well as to our programming and community engagement. Every piece of our work contributes to establishing our site as an active learning and community gathering space, and that includes talks like this tonight as well. So, with that being said, as I wrap up, I really hope that this continues your connection to the Brown Homestead. I encourage you to get involved with us, to attend our tours, our programs, our events, our workshops. We're looking for volunteers. We're looking for people to just get involved. So I see that we have our website and our social media has been linked in the chat. So definitely follow us, sign up for our email list. We are open in the summer as well. So we're open Thursdays to Saturdays between 10 and 4 p.m. through to Labor Day. And then we're open on Thursdays until Thanksgiving. So lots of opportunities to come and explore the site, get to know us. I'd like to thank you all for joining today. It's been really great to have you all here. And I hope at this point I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us. The one question I did have, the porch that the Chalus installed looked very much to me like the same era that the Painted Ladies in Grimsby. I must admit, I don't actually know. I know they're painted now. I assume they would have been painted then. Would the porch have been different colors as well?
Yeah, I do wonder. Unfortunately, we don't have at this point any modern photos or colorized photos of the porch to say. So it's perhaps it was colored because, like you say, the construction's very similar to the Grimsby Beach Painted Ladies. We know that those were brightly painted even back in the late Victorian era, so I would imagine that it was been painted like that as well, but hard to say.
Yeah, it's such a shame that you can't just go back and AI the color in and it would automatically figure out what colors it was because that
Yeah.
would be interesting. Yeah, if only I had a time machine.
I say that for so many things on the property,
Yeah.
especially anything to do with the Chalou family, because again, we know so little about their time living at the house.
And it was interesting to me that you said they had much less children with six. And I'm like, 11 is a lot, but still 6 is a lot.
I'm with you.
As Sarah said, the Brown Homestead is open now. You said Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, right? For
Yes, yes.
viewing, so you can pop by. I was saying to Sarah earlier, my son is in Scouts, and we often pass by because the Scout camp is right across the street. And as I was looking at the picture, I had the same thought that you did, because I know what's right across the street, that where's the trees? That must all be within the past 100 or so years that those have built up, and probably less than that because it was clearly a farm in the
Yes.
early part of the 1900s. Wow, fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you look on aerial maps, that area was farmed until the beginning of the Short Hills Park. So through until about the 1970s, you
Oh,
can tell
wow.
that there was vineyards. There was vineyards planted. And actually, part of the research with the Brown family burial ground is that its location was part of farmland. So in the 1950s, at some point, a farmer not related to the Brown family or the homestead at that point, they'd actually plowed the headstones to the edge of the property to farm, which is
Right.
why I had trouble locating the location of the burial ground until recently.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so yeah, it's so interesting. Like that area in the Short Hills, it's actually a research I'm doing right now, and a talk that I'm developing currently is how that area of the Short Hills was used because it's so different than what we know it today as a provincial park, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting for me because my husband and I moved to the Niagara region fairly recently, and we have on our back porch grapevines. So to see on the front porch of the house the grapevines coming across as well, it must have been either in the spring or in the fall when they took the pictures because you can't see the leaves, but
Yeah.
very clearly grapevines coming across, and how even right up to the house the farming would have been happening.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, we don't have those clear distinctions as we do today, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, we do still have the presentation from Andrew on our YouTube channel. If you want to see what was happening before and then rewatch this one again, you can do that. I would encourage you to go to the Brown Homestead website, and they are, as Sarah said, looking for funding for their ice cream creamer. So
Mhm.
any donations that you would want to make would be, I'm sure, very welcome. I'm looking forward to the ice cream. We already talked about that. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me and I can pass them on to Sarah. Again, this is our last presentation until the fall, and we hope we'll see you then. And thank you again, Sarah. You'll see a few of us over the summer.
That'd be wonderful. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity, and I hope to be back. We have lots of more research coming up, so I would love to share kind of new aspects of that we're trying to dig into about the Short Hills, about the Brown family burial ground, all of that. So yes, I hope to be back soon.
All right. Thanks a lot. See you later,
Thank
guys.
you. Have a great night, everyone.